people wanted to join the military. They wanted to be a part of whatever was going to be the response to 9/11.
Yeah, one of those the times, seemingly one of the last times that everybody in the U.S. had banded together, no matter your political affiliation, religious affiliation, whatever. Just at that time, we realized we're American citizens. We're under attack. We need to get back together. That seems like it was one of the last times it's happened.
I believe it was.
Welcome to the Nazarene Nerd Podcast. I'm David, the Nazarene Nerd, and today with me I have David Painter. Good to have you on.
Good to be here.
So I've known of you most of my life, but I don't think we really got acquainted until probably the last 3-4 years, maybe.
Most recently, the mission trip.
Yeah, and so I know, as much as I know of you, you don't seem like a bragging type of person, but I want to take a couple minutes and let you brag because I want to start with you in high school because I've heard all the stories about did you win states or you went to states a bunch of times or?
So I had a number of different sports. Now I look back on it now. There's some fond memories. Football was obviously the biggest sport at the time. And I was involved in football in one way, shape, or form since 7th grade. We didn't have middle school. It was senior high and junior high. So we had junior high football, but you couldn't play it until 9th grade. So I managed the first couple years. And the first couple years was when they had the 28-game unbeaten streak.
Okay.
So as I run into people, I ran into Sherry Smith the other day, Rodney and Brian's sister, and Rodney and Brian Smith played those first couple years that I managed. So I got to see
the last time we beat Bellwood.
Yeah. We beat Chief Logan.
That's right.
And it was after our streak, but they had a similar streak going, and no one gave us a chance on their home field. But I got to be there on the side when they did that. So I played football a number of years.
What position did you play?
I started out at quarterback and defensive back.
Okay.
And so when Naipaulver left at the end of my sophomore year and then Coach Rogish came in, I was still vying for quarterback. And so my junior year, I was actually starting quarterback, but then I broke my right wrist.
Oh.
So I didn't miss a game, but I couldn't play quarterback, so I continued punting.
Oh, okay.
So I was out for quite a few games, and when I came back, they switched me to wide receiver, and I was playing defensive end at that point in time. And my junior year, that was kind of the irony of playing quarterback and defensive end because I got to chase their quarterback around most of the game. But it's interesting because as I run into people nowadays, when I first moved back here, someone I never even knew watched football was a friend of my brother's. He said, "You're the punter." Mm-hmm. Because I worked on punting a lot in the fields back home, and I had a fair amount of success with it. And I think my longest was 70-some yards.
Wow.
But it was funny that somebody actually remembered that because it seems like it's like such a minor part of my sports history. Mm-hmm. Because and actually my junior and senior year, that's what I made all league in. I was first team all league my senior year as a punter of all things. But basketball with Coach Alcaro, Ron Matusky was the coach my sophomore year, but he died in a motorcycle accident up in Pogue. And Coach Bob Alcaro came in from Farrell, Pennsylvania. And it was kind of a culture shock for him because he was used to state championships and some very good teams. And he was hoping to do that here and replicate the success that they had out there. But it was hard coming into a small town where football was king.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just that. It was farming took priority. So sometimes on Saturday mornings, it was him and I. And he would go talk to the parents. And the parents were, well, you got to understand the priority here is getting the work done on the farm because that's where my child's going to go after high school. They're going to take over the family farm. And many of my classmates did. So I played basketball and lettered my junior and senior years, made all league, first team all league my senior year. Track was probably where I had my most fun and my most success.
That's all the stories I've heard was a lot of your track years.
Sometimes I look back and if I'd focused on the running all year long, they didn't have cross country until my junior year, but I was obviously in football at that point. What if? Mm-hmm. But I'm thankful I got the opportunity that I had, and I lettered all 4 years in track and Coach Neipolver gave me a lot of opportunities as a freshman. We were undefeated as freshmen,
Really? Wow.
unbeaten. We were on our way to. We had never won the county meet, and we were well positioned that year. Unfortunately, prom night was the night before, and that didn't bode well for the meet the next morning.
Yeah.
Not everybody was in good condition, but we were 9-0-1 that year.
So I want to say my either sophomore or junior year, and Coach Keim to this day still blames me that for the 4 years I did, I've lettered all 4 years too, and we won the county meet for the boys 3 out of those 4 years, and he blames me for the one because I missed an event. I missed the 200, which I don't think I would have placed anyway, but he still blames me for missing it, that we lost that meet.
That's interesting. All the successes that I can look back and I had a lot of success. I ran the 800 to 1600 and 3200, and then I also did the high jump. My freshman year, I also ran some relays, but I love some of the other events too. So after high school, I actually got to compete in intramural sports in the Army. I did the javelin, I did the long jump, I did the discus, and had a fair amount of success in that as well. But in high school, it was mostly 800, 1600, 3200 high jump, and I could usually win 3 or 4 of those in each meet. Probably one of my biggest competitors was Harry McCartney out of Mount Union. We raced a number of races my sophomore and junior year. He's the only one I think I never beat. We had some close races, especially on our track, but he always had just a little bit extra left. But he went on to states, and he actually ran in the low 420s,
Okay.
if not faster than that. And in my senior year, he was 1 year ahead of me. So my senior year, I didn't lose the mile until states. And I got second in the qualifier, which I was just thrilled to be there.
Yeah.
Now I qualified and made it to the finals. And but I was seated 12th going in. I placed 8th coming out. So I considered it an incredible success considering what the expectations were.
Yeah.
And considering where I was at districts that year, on the last lap, I was in last place. I had gotten boxed in, and the only way to get out was to drop back and come around the outside. And the coaches would tell you I didn't have a sprint, but I won it that day on a sprint in the last 250 yards. But being able to win districts was pretty significant, and that's a great memory. Being able to go to states, and then a few years later, as I was actually working as a manager with the West Point track team, we went to the Harvard Relays. And the gentleman that beat me in the prelims was one of the top runners collegiately in the country at the time. And I actually got to see him run indoors, and it made me even more appreciative. He beat me at in the prelims by a nose. I say that with a little bit of levity because their goal was just to get through the preliminaries. Mine was to just try to survive.
Yeah.
And I realized the next day I had run the second fastest race of my life the day before. They showed me what real running was. The next day when they ran 402, 403, 405 was 1, 2, and 3.
Wow.
And I came in at a little over 430.
Yeah, I think it was my junior year. We beat Bishop Guilfoyle we played 6 out of however many it was for the 4x4. And I'm a sprinter, 100, 200, I can do easily. 400, not so much. But what's nice about the 4x4 is I got a nice head start before I get the baton. And I think we beat Bishop Guilfoyle by like 0.001. And the ref yelled at me because he tried to run on the inside and cut me off. And the ref yelled and said, if you would have hit him, you'd have been the one disqualified. I'm like, he was cutting the inside of me. I couldn't do anything about it. But that was the highlight of, the only event I went solo at districts my senior year was a 200. I finally got a 2.424 at an invitational when we played at Juniata College with Huntington and Mount Union. So I finally got to go in that, and the kids there were insane. I'm running a 24-24. These kids are running 21-22. Like I didn't come in last in my heat, but I wasn't even close to coming in first or second.
Yeah, it's interesting when you get out of the small area and you compete with some of the larger schools and some of the schools with more resources, better tracks, more extensive programs. But with that said, I've seen a lot of our athletes coming out of Southern Huntington that are able to compete.
Oh, yeah.
So it's not unheard of, but a lot of it's self-motivation. It's being able to dedicate yourself year-round to training.
I've seen a lot of these kids recently. We've had more and more kids every year going to states. I think in the last, year or so, it wasn't as great. But I mean, the 2-3 years after I graduated, we've had 5, 7, 8 kids going to states, and that's like from my senior, I think we sent 2. So that many kids is just insane.
Yeah, it is. My senior year, it was Sonia Yingling, myself. Sonia actually went on to win the state championship, and I got 8th. I was on top of the world that year. Just having the opportunity to be there. At that point, there weren't very many all-weather tracks. Mm-hmm. The Bellwood Invitation, we ran on an all-weather track. We ran on an all-weather track at districts at Altoona. Mm-hmm. And then there were states, and Shippensburg had just gotten a brand new track. And I remember how springy it was. It was just amazing. Mm-hmm. But almost every track, I mean, Juniata Valley was still dirt, and that's where we held the county meet. Mm-hmm. Mount Union was dirt. We were gravel with
sand.
And
that first turn has always been sand.
It was one of the few places where we could have a home track advantage because of that first turn.
And that straight stretch 200 that nobody likes.
Yep, one of the few tracks where you could wear 1-inch spikes, which were pretty dangerous.
Which is legal there.
Yeah. So it is a little discouraging that no one will compete on our track anymore. Because it hasn't changed over the years. That was how we competed. Mm-hmm. But other schools have gotten better facilities, better tracks. So I understand things are a little bit different, but it's unfortunate that our athletes can't compete on their home track where they train, because it is different. Mm-hmm. I had the record in the 3200 and the 1600 for about 30 years. The 1600 was interesting. Coach Naipaver told me when I was a freshman, he didn't know what the record was, but he knew that in all the years and decades he'd been there, nobody had ever run under 430. When I won districts, I ran 429.9. So there was no question that no one else had ever run that. The 2 mile, I had run 10:15, and that actually stood for almost as long until Andrew Stanley broke them just a few years ago.
Yeah.
I was more of a specialist in the mid distance. I ran the 800, but I wasn't a sprinter. But I had a fair amount of success there. I always considered a 2 mile a little bit long. It would get a little bit boring.
Yeah.
But the mile was always, you were positioning on the first lap, and then on the second lap, you're getting ready for the next to last lap, and you're always positioning, and you only have that third lap that's really kind of dead, right there in the middle. And so it was always just kind of the right distance. It was easy to keep your head in the game. Running the first lap in sub 60 and the last lap in sub 60. And now I look back and wonder, those two middle laps were awful slow.
Yeah, that's insane. But my best 400 time was like 57. And besides, in my lap time for 4x4 was 52, which is about districts. So if I could run that for districts, I'd have made it. But I just from a block position, I couldn't shave off those 3 seconds. In sprinting, that's a lot, but for sub 60 for just mile, that is insane. That's almost my sprinting for one lap.
Well, the irony is I never ran faster than 2:07.5, but in a mile I could run two of the 4 laps in under 60. You'd think I'd be able to run under 2 minutes for the half, but I didn't. But that was kind of like the perfect distance where I could keep my head in the game, and there was a purpose for every lap as far as strategy for the race. I did continue running competitively for a few years. My first couple years in the Army, I did more road racing and 5Ks. Well, not necessarily, more 10Ks than 5Ks at that point in time.
That's where I hear the next set of stories of you basically embarrassing your drill sergeants and outrunning them and whatnot.
No, not too much. We never really ran against the drill sergeants. As I entered the Army, regular Army base training is more physical. So their biggest challenge is getting everybody physically ready to go out and be a productive part of the Army. For me, it wasn't really an issue. The running wasn't an issue. I worked on my push-ups and sit-ups until I could max those. And I found if I could max the PT test, that took a lot of stress off of a lot of things. As I went to language school, when I went out to the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, and I was there for 34 weeks. So the better part of it, 6 to 7 months studying German. It was a pretty intense academic environment, but I learned if you could max your PT test, you could do your PT on your own. I was actually on the running team out there, and we got to run down into Pacific Grove and run down around Cannery Row and back up. The last part was straight uphill, so the last 3/4 of a mile was straight up the side of the mountain. But it wasn't that big of a thing when I was in my teens.
Yeah.
I look at it now and it's pretty steep. I was able to go out there a few years ago, but we would go out and run on our own every day. So we had our own PT program. When I got to advanced individual training at Goodfellow Air Force Base, we were working shift work because of how the classes were designed and the facilities that we were in. And PT was normally when you're in San Angelo, Texas in the middle of summer, it's pretty hot. So you're talking 110, 120. So that was when group PT was. But if you maxed it, you could choose to do your own. So I bowed out and I would do mine after dark running around they had an airfield that was about 5 miles around.
It's nice and cool then.
And they had no planes coming in. So I just went out and ran around the abandoned airfield. It was at that point, actually, when I was in AIT, it was a challenging course. They threw a new block of instruction at us halfway through to see how everybody would do. It was testing it for future classes, but it still counted. And about 90% of our class failed it.
Wow.
Now you think failing a test, failing a quiz isn't that big, except you had one chance to retake it 72 hours later. If you failed, you were out and you had to go to another job in the Army. So you were reclassified. So I was pondering my near-term future. I was called in for counseling. We all had to be counseled by our instructor. My instructor was Sergeant First Class Eugene Hickman. And he called me in and we're sitting it was literally about an 8x8 room, no windows. It was just a counseling room. And he asked me if I ever thought about going to West Point. Well, being from this area, I'd never really heard of West Point other than the history books. I had no idea what it was. And I still joke to this day, I had no idea what the Army football team was. I thought it was enlisted soldiers, and I thought maybe I'd get a chance to try out for it someday. But that one day would change the direction of my life. And I tell a lot of people, God puts people in your path for a specific reason. And Sergeant First Class Hickman, an NCO that saw something in a young soldier that the young soldier would have never seen in himself. I came in, I was just looking for some money for college. I had no big ambitions. I wanted to be able to pay for college myself, even though my mom and dad had saved money for it. But this was an opportunity for me to get out on my own. So I was just looking at 4 years. I was a German linguist. I had passed languages too.
Can you still speak German?
I can. I actually studied it for 4 years at West Point as well, and did immersion training in Germany at a private school for one of my summers at West Point. That was the breaking point where I could actually switch back and forth between languages without having to think about it.
There we go.
So I'll come back around to that as I get to West Point and talk a little bit more about the German experience, because I was able to use the language later on in my career, at least to a limited extent. But here I am, Sergeant Hickman asked me if I ever thought about going to West Point. I didn't know what to say. So he actually gave me a little bit more information. There was a preparatory school for West Point, which puts you on a 5-year program. It's designed for folks that are coming out of high school that struggle academically but have all the other qualifications, because West Point looks at the military, academic, and athletic aspects of an individual when considering them for admission. So half of the students come right out of high school. The other half come out of the active duty force. So the Secretary of Defense has 180 appointments to West Point, or nominations, I should say. Most folks who apply to West Point have to go through their congressman, their senator, or U.S. representative. And each one of those have 5 nominations they can make to West Point. Now, nomination only gets you before the selection committee. So you still have to go through all the medical processing, DODMERB, the DOD medical evaluation review board. So you got to go through that whole process. You got to send your pack. Once that's all approved, then it goes before a selection board at West Point, and they will look at all aspects. They'll look at your academic. They'll look at leadership roles. They'll look at your athletic background. They'll look at all those aspects to select from. They encouraged us at the prep school to submit an, even though if we had 360 students, only 180 slots from the Secretary of Defense. So there was one day in the middle of the second semester, they called it Black Thursday, and that was where the dean would call out a number of names and said, just bring your books with you because you're done.
Oh, wow.
And so there was either graduation or there wasn't. If you were coming from high school, you went back home. If you were coming from the Army, you went back out and got reassigned. So Sergeant First Class Hickman helped me get my packet together. I continued on to Fort Devens. While my packet was being processed, I was learning how to do electronic warfare operations out of the back of old pickup trucks the Army used to call Cuck V's. So I was learning how to use some of the tactical equipment that the Army had. While I was there, my packet was approved. I got orders to USMAPS, U.S. Military Academy Preparatory School at Fort Monmouth. So I was on hold there for a number of months, waiting for the time to come where I'd go to Fort Monmouth. And that program is a year long. And as I mentioned, if you make it through, you make it through because you've got a nomination and actually an appointment to West Point. So they encouraged us to go ahead and apply through our congressman or representative. So I applied through our local representative here, and I actually got my nomination through our representative here in central Pennsylvania. So we actually had 183 folks graduate that year because 3 of us got our nominations elsewhere. So I did get accepted to West Point. I entered there in 1989. So graduating from high school in 86, I had 3 years before I went back in. The prep school was probably best for me in a number of ways. It helped me academically. Coming out, I look back at some of my report cards that my mom kept everything of, and my grades probably weren't as good as I thought they were coming out of high school. But the prep school focuses on, the first semester is just simply on raising your SAT and your ACT scores. So when I graduated, I think I had a 980. After about 3 months at the prep school, I was at a 1210 SAT. So that was about the average going into West Point. So that part was conquered. And then the second half is just preparing you for math and English for your plebe year. Because your plebe year, you're normally averaging about 18 and a half to 20 plus credit hours per semester, on top of all the military requirements, on top of all the athletic requirements, everything else that's going on. So it's a pretty stressful year, plus all the requirements of a plebe, getting up early, memorizing the newspaper, doing the minutes, doing all the required duties, getting your uniform ready, making sure it's ready, you're ready for inspection every single morning. So plebe year,
uniform to classes.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Well, really 24/7. There was no civilian clothes unless you were on leave, and then you still left in uniform, and you could change at the airport or when you got to your destination.
Wow.
So it was extremely regimented. You got, normally if you weren't in trouble, you could get one pass the first semester, which was normally Thanksgiving. You get a break at Christmas, and then you come back and you get one break in the spring. If you beat Navy in the football game, some years they will give you recognition early, right before graduation. During graduation week is normally when you can stop squaring corners and walking 100 miles an hour. And they have a big recognition ceremony where you can start calling your upperclassmen by their first names. So, and that's really huge as far as making it to that point. I can tell you our plebe year was pretty rough. We lost at least half of my company that year.
Wow.
There was an investigation. It was found that they actually, some of our upperclassmen actually had a list of people that they were looking to run out. Unfortunately, by the time that investigation concluded, most of the people were already gone.
Wow.
There was no written list, but there was enough evidence. There was a list that they were looking to weed people out. And so we started with about 40. In my company, there were about 20 left over at the end of the year. And that was unusual. We were one of the smaller companies coming out of that year. There was also an honor scandal the next year that cut another company down. So at the end of our second year, they actually scrambled our entire class. So we had a different company going into our last 2 years. And those are people, the company that I was with, Charlie 2, known as the Circus. And that was actually because there was an Air Force TAC officer at one point. So there was a little bit of history behind that. But most of those people we stay in contact with to this day. Sometimes we'll have Zoom meetings. There's always something on Facebook. Our class gets together regularly. I'm probably one of the outsiders on that because of where I'm located and because of some of the assignments I've had over the years. But it has been neat getting back together with some of them occasionally. And, 30 some years later, and everybody still remembers everybody for the most part. Now, there was over 1,000 people in our class. I can tell you there are a lot of people that I don't know. One of the saddest parts, and this is happening across the Army and across our veterans community, and that's the problem with suicides right now. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing so much with veterans, with Masterpiece Retreat Center, is to try to give veterans a place where they can come and share stories and share some of the challenges they're going through so they don't feel like they're on their own.
And that's a project you're wanting to start as well, to get veterans' stories archived that have never had a chance to, tell somebody their story.
It is, and we're focusing on Huntington County in particular, but a little bit more broadly in central Pennsylvania. Tomorrow we're headed to the Veterans Home in Hollidaysburg to put on a gospel concert, and we actually have a group of people that are just coming to sit with the veterans and share some time with them. We found that was, while they enjoy the music, they want to share their stories. Most of them don't get visitors. They're confined there, for lack of a better term. Most of them are wheelchair bound. They're getting all the services they need, but they don't have much social interaction outside of the staff there. So we go up, they invite us up every 2 months and gives us a chance to interact with them musically. Some of the ladies in the area will make quilts or pillowcases or gifts. Some of the kids in the local elementary schools do cards for them around Christmas. So we've had some really neat exchanges with them, and we've gotten to know some of the people pretty well. So we're heading back tomorrow to Eisenhower Hall. We'll sing some songs. We'll take a break. But the most important thing is just having people to sit there and talk. So last time we had 17 people, maybe 5 or 6 of us sang. Everybody else sat and spent time. That was because it was the biggest challenge. Is you want to be able to sit and listen to somebody, but somebody behind them might be waving their hand trying to get your attention. A great group of folks. But what we found is in the last 24 months now, just out of my class at West Point, we've probably lost 4 or 5 to suicide. Most recently retired, with the world ahead of them. Our class has been through quite a bit from Bosnia, Serbia, Herzegovina, and the operations in that area early on in our careers. Everybody in some way, shape, or form has been involved in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places around the world. So there's been a lot of PTSD. There's been a lot of folks that have been wounded. We've lost classmates in combat. So when the suicide started hitting a few years ago, our class made a big effort to get everybody together. Every company tries to get together at least once a year, even if it's just Zoom, to try to reconnect and let folks know, hey, you're not alone out there. So I graduated in 93. There were some challenging years there. I can tell you it was probably my second year. And it was the year I did chemistry and physics all in the same year. And it was challenging. I didn't have a real strong mathematics background. I mean, I'd taken calculus, but there was a whole new level there.
I can get that coming from Southern Huntington, so.
I can tell you, chemistry, I barely passed, but a D was passing.
D for degree.
I came out of my shell a little bit with physics. I struggled with it until I realized I needed to ask questions. And being in a class is one thing with 20 people. When you engage with the instructor and the instructor can sit down, that's why I encourage my kids, don't feel like you're in a bubble, go ask questions. It was presented completely differently, and it really turned my year around as far as physics. The biggest challenge that we had was probability and statistics. And I can tell you, when I went home for Christmas, We had our term end examination. It was worth 40% of our grade. It was worth 1,600 points, and I needed 1,240 points to pass. I had a 65 going in, and I knew in order to maintain that, I had to have 1,240. It's a 4-hour exam, so about 3.5 hours, they don't allow you out of the room for restroom breaks or anything, and they post a solution in the hallway. And I remember at the end, I went out and I looked at that solution probably 3 or 4 times. I got 1210, I got 1250, I got 1240, and finally I said, God, it's in your hands. I can't sit here and continue to add these up. That was my last one. I went on Christmas break. If I had failed it, and I waited on Christmas break for the phone to ring, because if you fail, then they tell you you're going to have an academic board to be considered for expulsion or termination. The phone didn't ring. I don't know. I never found out what I got on that test. I just know I passed with a 65.0, so it was pretty close to 1240. So, there were some close calls. There were some challenges mentally. West Point was more, we went through basic training again. So if you could imagine learning how to shoot your M16 again, learning how to do land nav, going through the gas chamber again, all that fun stuff, because they're trying to familiarize you with some of the basics in the Army. So another 8 weeks of basic training. But again, I had been through the Army. I was familiar with that. So physically, it was good. Mentally, you had to get used to memorizing the New York Times, memorizing all of the knowledge. That was my biggest challenge, was trying to memorize stuff. Still is to this day. But getting up in the morning, trying to read through the whole New York Times before breakfast, and you have to have memorized the breakfast menu, the lunch menu, the dinner menu, and somebody is out underneath the clock calling minutes to make sure nobody's late, normally with somebody yelling in your face. You get out to formation, and then you're reciting all your knowledge. They want to know what's in the sports page, what's in the newspaper. You never have time to read it all, but you try to get the highlights, and you try to skim it as much as you can to retain as much. And then going to...
Can I ask what the point of that was? I mean, I get it's probably building muscle memory of, things, but like just to memorize a newspaper...
To be able to pick out the most important pieces of the news.
Oh, okay.
New York Times is a big newspaper. To be able to pick out the highlights and to be able to converse in those at any given time throughout the day. You never know when you're going to be stopped. So it's prioritizing what you're reading, but also how you convey that. So you're doing presentation at the same time under a lot of stress while somebody's critiquing your uniform, critiquing what you said wrong. And it could be the newspaper, it could be knowledge. And we have a Bugle Notes, which was a book of knowledge, knowing how, for example, how many gallons are in Lusk Reservoir. It's 78 million when the water's flowing over the spillway. Amy gets a kick out of that because there were some things just over the years she's picked up. And but there was a lot of things that go with the history of West Point, duty, honor, country, being able to recite the most important parts of MacArthur's speech when he left the military after 50 some years. Worth battalion orders. There's a whole book that you have to memorize throughout your plebe year, most of it in your first few weeks. So again, it's just a matter of being able to understand the history of West Point, some important aspects of the military, important leaders of the military. I didn't know much about West Point when I went in there. It was interesting. One of the first posters I think I saved was, the history we teach here was made by those that we taught here. Much of the history we teach here was made by those we taught. So it was really interesting, the perspective. But when you look at it, when you're studying military history, and that was only a small piece of what we learned, because it is one of the top engineering schools in the country. It does compete with the Ivy League. When you look at rankings every year coming out, everything from nuclear engineering to, they have an incredible computer science, electrical engineering departments. For myself, everybody graduates with a Bachelor of Science in Engineering, and I did, but I majored in German and I minored in systems engineering. So there are other disciplines. You can major in law, you can major in some of the other softer disciplines, but you have to have that background in engineering to graduate from there. So I did choose German because I did have background in that, but it was really interesting. I could explain to you how a diesel engine could work in German, but I couldn't explain it to you in English. It was things that we had to learn in different levels of classes. I was actually taking classes my plebe year with juniors and seniors because of where I was in the progress. But that allowed me to progress a little bit faster. So after my sophomore and junior years, I spent both summers in Germany.
Okay.
So the first summer I studied at a private school in Berlin and lived with a German family. Absolutely no English whatsoever. The only language we had in common at school was German. So we had to figure it out. I can tell you it's the first major city that I flew into. West Point gave me a plane ticket and they gave me an address and phone number and said, be back in 6 weeks.
Wow.
The Army is pretty good about putting everything in place, and there's no way to fail when you're traveling between places. But so I expected when I landed in Berlin, there would be a family standing there with this big sign that said painter. And they weren't. They weren't. I get off the plane in Berlin and I'm looking around. There's nobody. Thought maybe they forgot. So I pulled out the phone number and I figured out how to use the phone. And I called them and they said, no, we didn't forget. We're just waiting for you here. So how do I get there? Well, you can take bus 1 to bus 10 to bus 21. There was about 10 different bus connections. I'd never ridden a bus in the city in my life. I'd ridden a school bus, but that's a little bit different. So I'm standing there thinking, okay, how am I going to do this? Well, I took a taxi. I can tell you in 5 weeks, I had figured out the subway system. I had figured out the buses. When I went back to the airport, I took the buses and didn't think twice. Now, I was speaking German at that point. I had not spoken English in 5 weeks, and I don't drink alcohol or anything close to it. But the stewardess probably thought I was drunk because all my verbs came at the end of the sentence when I got on the plane. I was having trouble switching back to English. So to this day, I can still switch back and forth. My vocabulary is rusty. When I travel back to Germany, because we went back and taught there a number of times in my last assignment, it takes me the better part of about a week and a half to 2 weeks to actually get fluid again. But I can switch without thinking, which was interesting. When I took Spanish in high school for 4 years, it was a matter of translating in my head what I wanted to say. And I did that with German for so long. Okay, I'm going to say this. Here's what it means in German, or here's how to say it in German. When you cross that threshold to where you're fluent, you don't even think about it. You switch back and forth. If you're conversing in German, you see and you think everything in German. And that was the hardest thing for the first 5 or 6 years of speaking German. I couldn't do that. But being in full immersion was an incredible experience.
I've noticed that like the easiest way to learn a language is just get dropped off in that country and just fend for yourself, because you're either going to figure it out or you're just going to get lost and not make it.
But it was neat, and Germany is an easy country to get around. So the other part of that was, so I did fly in, I figured out the transportation systems. The second summer, all they did was give us a ticket to Frankfurt and said, but here's the address in Germany. We were working with the German Panzer Battalion in Westerwald. Westerwald happened to be at the end of the train line. We had to figure out the train system that summer. So there were 2 of us that traveled together, which was actually a mistake, because between us and our sponsor, there wasn't much German spoken between us because he spoke English most of the summer.
Yeah.
I learned more about Germany that summer because we traveled a lot. I learned the train system. I learned different things. I traveled all around on my own. First summer, I didn't leave Berlin. The second summer, I traveled all over. The interesting thing, so the first time I was over there would have been the summer of 1991, right after the Berlin Wall fell. I was living in an affluent side of town. Trying to remember the name. It was on the northern side, but it was an affluent side of Berlin, Schönau. And so when I went out and did my morning runs, I would actually go out and run on. There was in the middle of the fields, there was a concrete pad you could turn, and that was where the fences were surrounding Berlin. So the infrastructure was still pretty evident. When we took the subway into East Berlin, you knew exactly in the tunnels, even when you were in East Berlin, because the infrastructure was so poorly maintained. And then when you would come above ground, it was the same type of car. Everybody had the same type of car. It was so stark, the difference between the East and West. But the feelings and tensions and the animosity between the East and West Germans was still pretty raw. The West Germans had a hard time forgiving the East Germans, especially the East German soldiers. As East Germans tried to escape, there were so many people killed along the border, and that was Germans shooting Germans. There was a lot of animosity between East and West at that point in time. But it was an incredible experience, and I did make it back on time. And so anyways, the 4 years of West Point it was an incredible experience. Challenges aside, mental, physical. I had some injuries, back injuries, foot injuries playing basketball when the tendon of your foot on the ball, the arch of your foot disconnects. When you're cutting to the basket, that was something I'd never experienced before. So that was, I think when Amy first met me, I was on crutches.
I see a theme of that in your painter side of the family.
Well, the back injury has probably haunted me more than anything. We were playing a sport called flicker ball, which is a mixture between football and basketball. So it's played with a football on about a half a football size field, but your goal was a basket backboard with a hole in the middle. So there's some debate right now between my company mates, whether we won the actual championship at West Point that year for intramurals or whether we were second. The reason I don't remember it is I think it was in the semifinals was when I herniated a disc in my back. Just simply caught a ball. The way I landed, a disc popped out. But we had a whole team of former high school quarterbacks. So we were pretty well stacked for that because it was all about throwing the football and how accurate you could be. So I ended up in traction, and that injury has affected me throughout my career, but we just managed around it. Amy would tell you every time we tried to move, my back would go out because we always did a do-it-yourself move in almost every place. And when we'd start lifting boxes, my back would go out, and she would orchestrate the rest of the move. But how I met her was incredible. I had dated another cadet for probably about a year. When I was in Germany the second time, she broke that off with me. And we never talked a whole lot after that. When I got back for my senior year, actually it was during the summer, while I was still in Germany, I was still really close. I was really close to my oldest brother, Alan, and his wife, Michelle. And I called and talked to him one day, and off the cuff, I asked Michelle if she knew anybody that wanted to come up for ring weekend, let me know. I didn't think she'd take me seriously, let alone I never had the nerve to really ask anybody for a date. So next thing I know, she calls and says she has somebody that's going to come up. And I'm like, what do I do now? So Amy stayed at the Officers Christian Fellowship House with a number of other dates. They had a big house overlooking the Hudson. And we just got to spend a lot of time together that weekend. And I think we knew it was a done deal before that weekend was over. She wasn't looking for a relationship. I wasn't looking for a relationship, but God had a plan nonetheless. So we got married a week after graduation in 1993. And we actually came back, stayed with mom and dad here in Three Springs, just outside of Three Springs, for about a month and a half. We got kind of bored just hanging out. I didn't have to report to the signal school at Fort Gordon until August, so we had some time. Well, we got a little restless, so we decided to look for a job. And so Amy knew her last two foster families were in Greencastle, so she had a lot of connections over there, and somebody she knew owned a motel, so he needed some painting done. So we were actually painting the railing one day, and somebody walked past and asked him who was doing the painting. He said, "That's the painters." No, what's their name? He goes, "No, really, it's the painters." So, but those kind of experiences really helped us bond, and you just got to do things together. And for our honeymoon, right after our wedding, we actually went to Disney. So we went to Disney, visited some friends in Atlanta on the way back up. It was a colonel and his wife, Colonel Al Johnson and Cheryl, who had taken me under their wing at the language school. My first weekend out there, I'm coming out of basic training, not knowing what to expect in the rest of the Army because everything had been so regimented. I show up on a Friday, and my platoon sergeant says, "Here's your room." It was like a hotel room. We had our own bathroom. There were only two of us in a room. I was like, wow, it was brand new. I said, "We'll see you on Monday." Like, what do I do between then and now?
Whatever
enjoy
you
the
want.
weekend.
Yeah.
And I remember waking up on a Saturday morning and hearing dogs barking. I'm like, what in the world? So we're up on the hill in the Presidio of Monterey overlooking the bay. So I took off on a trek to find out where the dogs were barking. It was seals
Oh,
down, down off the wharf. But just an incredible place out there. I went to chapel the very first Sunday, and they said, if anybody's interested in starting a singles group for Christ, come to this address. And I walk up to the address, and I remember looking at the steps and seeing Colonel Alvin B. Johnson. And I'm like, what am I doing here? I was a PV1, I was a private, and here's this colonel. What am I doing on his front step? But Alan Sherrill really became a second set of parents to me over the years. He wrote a recommendation that helped me get into West Point, and we remained connected for years. He was a Vietnam veteran with 1st Cav and with Special Forces in Vietnam. He actually died of cancer a number of years ago. Was buried at Arlington. Cheryl's still living in Atlanta. But we had a chance to visit them right after we got married, and then we headed up and visited Barbara and Larry in Chicago. So we did this big circle, but then we ended up back here, and that's when we ended up painting railings. But we ended up going down to Fort Gordon. That was where my signal officer's basic course was. So at West Point, you get your class ring at the beginning of the year. Second semester, you get your branch for the Army. And you can request what branches you want in priority. Depending what your class rank is, depends on whether you get your first, second, third, fourth. So the majority of the class gets their first choice. There's a lot of people that want to go infantry. There's a lot of people that want to go armor because those are the combat branches. There's not very many slots for military intelligence or military police. So those can go out pretty quick. So as best I can remember, I requested military intelligence because that's what I was as a German linguist. I was in intelligence. And I thought, well, that was what I knew. Military police sounded pretty cool. That's what my brother-in-law had done. Engineering sounded pretty cool, but coming out of West Point, there's a lot of engineers. So I was about 670 or so out of a little over 1,000. So I was just over halfway through my class. Most got their first or second choice. Somehow I got my 5th choice. I didn't even know at the time. When I got it, I opened my envelopes. It's a big ceremony, and they bring you all together in Eisenhower Hall, which seats about 5,000 or 6,000. And so you're there as a class. You're in your full dress, and they give you the sealed envelope, and you got to wait for the command open envelopes. So everybody's sitting there trying to feel, and crossed rifles for infantry. You can kind of figure out what those are. So most of the people kind of figured what they had. I'm sitting there feeling my envelope. I have no idea. And then I open them like cross flags because the signal branch is cross semaphores, the old signal flags. But that was, it was, a blessing in disguise. Learning how to work with Unix operating systems, with designing communication networks, designing computer networks. In the basic course, you're mostly focusing on Army standard equipment, so how to set up communications networks, cellular networks, things like that. But that wasn't how my career path would go. It would be anything but standard. And so we ended up in Alaska, and people still to this day ask me where I was stationed in Germany since I studied German for so many years. I said, well, sometimes the Army doesn't work things the way you think they are. I said, I studied German for 7 years. I've never stationed in Germany. They asked me why I didn't pick that after West Point. I said, well, I wanted to try something different, so I chose Alaska. And I ended up in a signal battalion up there. I worked in a communication center for the first year. I worked with a satellite platoon, and it was just an incredible experience. Both my 2 sons were born up there. And they joked with us when we arrived that it was a 2-baby tour for 3 years. Everybody left with 2 children. We did. We left with 2 children. But it was an incredible 3 years, and we have friends, 30 years later, we still have friends that live in Alaska, and we still have connections up there with our church, our youth group. I think some of our youth group are grandparents now. It's a little hard, but Amy still keeps in contact with some of them, and some of them work missions up there as well. So it's great to have some of those connections and to be able to keep in contact with those folks up there. But some of the things we did in communications up there, I learned some things I would have never learned in another organization. Communications are challenging in Alaska, especially satellite communications. We actually had civilian equipment So we had civilian vans that were painted camouflage. It was a unique, one of a kind thing up there, but the terrain had some challenges that we had some unique solutions to. So I got to learn some things from some very inventive folks up there. We went back to Georgia for the Signal Officers Advanced course. We were really connected to a church down there from the first time we were there, and that was Barton Chapel United Methodist Church. And it was a small church. It was a country church, one room. And it was being swallowed up by a pretty bad part of Augusta. When we came back the second time, we actually lived in the parsonage and helped them fix that up. It had just been through a fire. And I remember being in there with our two boys. One's under one, and Jonathan was just around 2 years old, and we had gunfire almost every night on the back 40.
Wow.
Because it was a big lot, but it was surrounded by some questionable neighborhoods. But that church and everybody in it remains friends to this day. That was our home church for many years, and the family had lived there for 8 years. I say the family because I came and went a couple times. Amy had some unique medical challenges, so I tried to keep stability. She had good medical care there, so it was also where I deployed the most out of, and the church really took my family in when I was deployed to Kuwait 4 different times, 2 on contingency operations, Operation Desert Fox and Desert Thunder. But they all just pitched in and took care of my family. And when that happens, connections are made for a lifetime. And that's actually how we ended up getting our 5th child. You've probably heard part of the story. We had 4 children, but we ended up with 5 later on. And Fred was friends of ours out of Barton Chapel. They took custody and eventually adopted their great nephew. And he grew up, they both passed away by the time he was 16. And he actually came to live with us in Virginia. So we'll always consider him our 5th child. And he's doing well. He's actually back down in Augusta working for TSA at the airport down there. And things are going pretty well for him. But so when I got back down there, I went to the basic course, and we were trying to figure out what our next assignments were. And they had an assignment. So there's a lot, as you can imagine, the home of Signal has a lot of signal units. So there was some folks that stayed there, some folks that went Germany, Korea, Fort Huachuca, different places around the United States. Every place needs to communicate. But they had one assignment there. There was a military intelligence brigade, the 513th Military Intelligence Brigade, and they needed a communications officer. And I had a clearance for my time in the intelligence community, so they asked me if I'd be interested. I said, absolutely. Well, that eventually led, I never had a signal company. Platoon leader, XO. I did that in Alaska. To be a company commander was the next step. And here I am in a military intelligence company, working with more communications assets than I would have had in any signal company. It was kind of cool. But I asked the battalion commander one day if I could go interview for a company command in the signal units, and she said, absolutely. I had a good relationship with everybody in those units because we had been deployed together a number of times. She came back the next day and asked me if I would consider taking one of her companies, and it was actually the line company that I had served in, the operations company, for the first 2 years there. I ended up having my company command for 2 years there. And then in my last trip to Kuwait, I ran into a friend, and you remember the musician that came and played for our veterans dinner last year, Ed Schaefer. He was actually over there with a team working on some things. And he was in a unit called Land Information Warfare Activity, was in the transition to First Information Operations Command, and he asked me if I was interested in coming to work for them. Well, I was building and designing computer networks and doing all software, hardware. I was doing a whole range of different things with the unit I was in. This was intriguing, so I'm like, absolutely. If you want to try to pull me in, try to pull me in. Well, the Signal Corps thought so much about that when I got back that I quickly got a call. They were really slow in giving me an assignment until somebody tried to pull me into another branch. And then they said, well, here's your choice of recruiting company commands. Burlington, Vermont was one. That would have probably been, thinking back, that would have been pretty intriguing. I would have loved the area up there. but there wasn't much for medical treatment for Amy, and that had to be my primary concern. I ended up taking Greenville Company in eastern North Carolina, so I had everything from I-95 to the Outer Banks, from the North Carolina border down to Goldsboro, North Carolina. It's the whole northeast section of East Carolina. We used to say our company had the most tobacco fields and the biggest swamp in the battalion. But we had a lot of success there. Recruiting, when I first took the recruiting command, that was in 2001, in August of 2001. Of course, you know what happened in September of 2001 with 9/11. We just went and visited the Flight 93 Memorial this week on our way back from Pittsburgh. And it brought back a lot of memories. I was in my company headquarters that morning when things started to happen, and our secretary ran out and got a little black and white portable TV from her apartment and brought it back, and we were watching it. They secured the whole building. Nobody knew what was happening. But one of the results of that, there was people wanted to join the military. Mm-hmm. They wanted to be a part of whatever was going to be the response to 9/11.
Yeah, one of those the times, seemingly one of the last times that everybody in the U.S. had banded together, no matter your political affiliation, religious affiliation, whatever. Just at that time, we realized we're American citizens. We're under attack. We need to get back together. And it seems like it was one of the last times it's happened.
I believe it was, and the country really came together. There was the left, the right. There really wasn't any. It was the United States looking at this threat. But people really pulled together. There was a lot of people that wanted to join recruiting. People were coming to us to want to join.
You can even see that in the comic books. I know that I'm still trying to get a hold of it, but there's an Amazing Spider-Man issue that Spider-Man blames himself because New York City is his home, and there's just this scene in it where you get Doctor Doom, one of the baddest villains in Marvel. He's got a tear in his eye because even though as much of a villain he is to the U.S., this is his home country. So it was just a neat little thing they did at the time. Even throw it in comic books too to make it relevant and real.
Yeah, so I spent 2 years in recruiting. Normally they say the 3 R's are career killers, and that's ROTC, recruiting, and ACRC, which you're working with reserve units. I actually did 2 of those 3. It did anything but end my career. We had an incredible 2 years there. We had some challenging months, but I had a great bunch of NCOs. I can tell you it's one of the most stressful jobs probably anywhere in the Army. And it seems you wouldn't think that, but there's so much stress they bring some of the best soldiers from some of the from line units around the Army, and they put them in a position. These are soldiers that aren't used to failing, and they will give it their absolutely 150%. They will work 6 to 7 days a week, and you're talking anywhere from 12 to 18-hour days trying to meet their numbers. And it's really a numbers game. And I learned probably more about math and recruiting than in probably a bad way, because you can tell the same story in many different ways with the same numbers. Mm-hmm. It was amazing how things were represented. But when I first got there, Recruiting Command had met its mission, I think, for the first time ever. So things were really high. 9/11 happened. We had a lot of folks coming to us, but there were still some down months. And I watched some of the worst coming out of some leadership and how they responded to some of those challenges. I watched some really good leaders. It's like, okay, we understand there are marketing trends we have to be aware of. We're gonna make it through this, and we'll get back on top, and we'll get back into the successful side. So I watched the threatening side. You're going to make mission regardless, or you're going to be punished, versus if you do this right, you're going to be successful. So I got to see a lot of good things. I got to see some really good NCOs at work. After that, I went back to Fort Gordon because that was where my family was. That was a geographic bachelor tour. I was in for 2 years recruiting because I was on the road 3 to 4 out of 5 days of the week, and sometimes on the weekends. So it wouldn't have behooved me to start Amy off with a new medical network where some of the services may or may not have been available. So I left her down at Fort Gordon. Again, the church just pitched in. I never had to worry about anything. Mm-hmm. God put everybody in the place that we needed him to be. So after 2 years, there was an assignment that came open back at Fort Gordon. It was working with a reserve unit to train National Guard and Reserve signal units. So that was where I worked in Battalion S3 shop, my battalion executive officer position for branch qualifying. And I was there for 2 years, and we did some neat things. Again, some really great soldiers. I got to see some people do some incredible things there. And then one Sunday on drill weekend, Amy said, so all this time, I didn't make it to that unit of Ed Schaefer, who had met in Kuwait. But I was coming up for an assignment. I had actually applied for a functional area 30, which was information operations, and I'd been accepted. So I was watching their branch assignments page, and there was an assignment that came up for 1st IO Command. Amy calls me on a Sunday because she was watching it too, and she said, I think this is the unit we're looking for. So I called the assignments manager, and he said, you want to go there? I said, absolutely. Little did I know I'd spend 17 years there.
Wow.
But he said, well, I got news for you. You've been misassigned by the Signal Corps. You were supposed to be ours some time ago, so you're going to be moving pretty quickly. So again, I left the family in Georgia because I was supposed to deploy almost right away to Afghanistan. That did not happen. Assignments changed a little bit. I was still in the same unit, but just it was how the assignments and taskings worked. So I brought the family up in summer of 2005. I did end up deploying in 2006, and I spent about 6-7 months in Afghanistan with Combined Forces Command Afghanistan. And again, God puts you in places there's no mistaking. Mm-hmm. He put you there for a reason, and I saw so many things over there. One thing about Afghanistan, it is an Islamic country. Mm-hmm. It is by its constitution, it is an Islamic country. And 99% of the country are Muslims. When I went over, there were 2 Jews, 2 rabbis, there was one each in 2 cities. One later died, so we had one. But very little Christian presence. But what was interesting is I was stationed in Kabul, and we would have our Sunday morning services, but more importantly, our weekly Bible studies. The missionaries and some of the aid workers in the local area would come in because it was the only place they could come to services. Mm-hmm. And there was one missionary that had been there for some time, and I won't say his name online, but he and his wife had been working there for many, many years, and they were expecting their first child, and they had to make I think it was a 3 to 6 week journey to Kabul for the baby to be delivered, and then they had to wait there till the baby was stable, and they were headed back out to where there was no running water, no electricity. Wow. Because that was where God had planted them, and they were ministering through providing aid and providing essentials to the local villages in a very remote part of Afghanistan. So to see firsthand the sacrifices some of these people were making, it was absolutely incredible. And then to see how God was opening doors for people to share the gospel in a country where it was illegal, except in certain circumstances, to share the gospel. For example, to have somebody teaching air traffic controllers in downtown Kabul. And she was a Christian, and she was teaching Afghan males, Muslim males, on how to be air traffic controllers. But she couldn't share her faith because it's illegal to proselytize unless they ask a question. And that particular year, it was Easter. And the Muslims' weekend was Thursday and Friday. Our weekend was Saturday and Sunday. So when she was getting ready to turn them loose for their weekend, she goes, I won't see you for a little while because we have a holiday. And they're like, what holiday? She goes, what holiday do you think it is? Some said Christmas, some said New Year's, 4th of July, or the Independence Day. Somebody said Easter, and somebody asked her, well, what is Easter? And she actually had the opportunity to share the gospel with no repercussions because God opened the door, and they asked her the question because they wanted to hear what was so important in her life about this holiday. Mm-hmm. So it was really cool. When I redeployed that same year, so that fall, Combined Forces Command Afghanistan was stood down. The International Security Assistance Forces, ISAF, took over all the operations. So Combined Forces Command no longer existed. So I came back. Again, I was working at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and I got an email asking me what the status of my application for MIT was. MIT? I was looking at retirement. I wasn't even thinking about getting my master's degree, let alone at MIT. Mm-hmm. Well, apparently General Petraeus and the staff out at Fort Leavenworth, he was with the Combined Arms Center, and he was very supportive of our field of information operations. And he knew it was the officers corps was just kind of getting their footing, but we didn't have any professional education. So he had just approved advanced civil schooling for FA-30s, for information operations officers. And little did I know, I didn't even apply, but I got selected and approved for grad school, and I didn't even ask for it. So the next morning, I still didn't know that it was actually me. So I got the email. I knew there were 7 David Painters in the Army because I got emails and notices for all of them at times. And there are some stories for another day, but there were some interesting stories behind that. So the next day, I sent an email back out to Fort Huachuca. I said, this sounds like a great opportunity, but you got the wrong David Painter. They called me right away and said, no, we got the right one. We just forgot to tell you you were selected for this new program. Well, it's pretty intimidating, never taken a GRE. And here we are in November, and I got to take a GRE. There wasn't even one available. I'm going to take a GRE for MIT, for a master's in political science. Well, it turns out MIT dropped out of the program, and they called me back and asked, well, how would you feel about going to Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies right there in D.C.? I didn't have to move. They didn't require a GRE. And it was a 1-year master's program in international policy and international public policy. And absolutely.
Yeah.
So coming out of that, I had an opportunity that they couldn't figure out. Now they had an advanced civil schooling program, but they didn't have any assignments to complement that program. So they were sending most of the people. There were 5 in the program selected. I think only 4 got accepted to the schools. So they were signing them back out to the regular Army. And I called up the branch officer one day and I said, I'm just kind of wondering, what do you have available for assignments? And he was kind of frustrated because we couldn't take advantage of the program and work in the interagency. And so I went and talked to one of my professors because she was working on a national security staff at the time. And she was still teaching in the evenings. And she said, they're standing up a new strategic communications cell at the State Department. Let me see. Well, the person that was leading it was somebody I was familiar with from a previous assignment. And so the Army agreed to send me there. The assignments process was a little convoluted, and that was challenging, but the right people in the right places made it happen. Mm-hmm. So I ended up working at the State Department for 3 years with the coordinator for counterterrorism, working programs to counter violent extremism. And one of the most fun pieces there, for the first 2 or 3, maybe first month at the State Department, I didn't have a computer account. It had nothing but paper and pen. And they said, well, we have this, here's the funds we have to work with. What would you recommend we do with it? So actually I made PowerPoint slides with pen and paper. And it took about a year and a half, but we actually it was a CVE workshops, multinational CVE workshops, where we could bring diplomatic teams from multiple countries. Ultimately, it was about 14 countries where we get together, share ideas, and try to figure out where we were duplicating programs. And it was really neat. And that was where I got to meet the counterterrorism coordinator for Germany. I think she was I don't know if she was an ambassador, but she was at that level. And she put me on we were actually in Rotterdam for a meeting, and we were at dinner, and she knew from some of the coordination that we had done and some of the planning that I was a German linguist. So she put me on the spot that night to see how well I would do. So I was pretty rusty at that point. But being able to work with other countries, it was things you could have never imagined. Here I am. I came in as an E1, looking to serve 4 years in the Army, get some money for college, not even knowing what I wanted to do in college. And here I have an opportunity. I had money for college through the Army GI Bill and Army College Fund. But then the Army sent me to West Point, and then out of the blue, they sent me to grad school. And through grad school, I'm able to work with other countries in some very challenging areas. And it was just such a blessing to be able to do some of that. At the end of that, we made a decision to retire in 2011. As I was retiring, There was a continuing resolution, so it was hard to find a job. And I was actually out processing my unit, and the S1 asked me, the chief of administration asked me, how's the job search going? I said, well, it's not really right now. The State Department had offered me a position, but they didn't have the money to support it either. And he suggested I go talk to the lead contractor who had just had an instructor put in his notice, and I end up teaching for the next 11 years.
Wow.
3 years as a contractor, and then another 8 as a DA civilian. And at that point, I had never seen myself speaking in front of crowds. I was never comfortable with it. I did it on occasion, but I was never real comfortable with it. But through all that, it didn't matter whether it was 20 or 50 or 100. I loved what I did. I loved, with a passion, teaching soldiers, working with soldiers, realizing I was a little bit older than I used to be when the lieutenants come up and ask you for career advice. And one thing I told them, I said, have fun. I said, there will be people that tell you you have to have all these checklists done in order to be successful. I will tell you, I didn't do it. I couldn't do airborne school because of my back. I wasn't even a signal company commander. I'm a signal officer that commanded an intelligence company on a signal post. I couldn't have been any further off track to what people would have said. But God had a track in mind that I could have never anticipated.
I always love the joke that's if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans.
Yeah.
Because I mean, if I was a check all the boxes type of person, I wanted to, as a young kid, I wanted to be a police officer. That never worked out. And even so, they always said I wanted to go for criminal justice, and they always said, "Don't do that because you don't need that degree you just need a bachelor's degree to get into the police academy." And then I want to go on and play football, but obviously that didn't work out. I failed out of college after about a year with a 1.2 GPA. I'm like, I'm not wasting their $6,000 to go back. And then so I decided I'm just gonna work. And 10 years ago, if you'd asked me, because I'm now got a promotion at work, I'm now the lead, or what used to be called the foreman of my shipping department. If you would ask me 10 years ago, do you think you're going to be the boss of people and even the boss of people that are like twice your age? I said, probably not. I was one of the, most mediocre employees that just got by on the pay that they gave me. And now I'm like a perfect example of someone who was lazy enough to get by, that just needed a kick in the pants by, a specific someone who used to be my boss there. He got me motivated, and now I wish he was still there so he could see where I'm at, but I did get a chance to call him and say, hey, just, checking in on you, and just want to let you know I finally got that position that we were working for. So, it's the plans you have never, 99% of the time don't work out the way that you want them to.
No, and for me, my faith is, I've tried to always keep my faith at the center of what I did in the Army. And that can be very challenging in an environment that's supposed to be apolitical, and you're not to actively share your faith in most situations, but how you live your life reflects where your heart is. And it was interesting at the State Department. I had a boss that, and there's been a number of different jobs where their language was very, very seedy, if you will.
Yeah, I work at a warehouse.
And I never said anything, but
yeah,
they knew by the fact that I did not use profanity. They caught themselves to the point I had 2 or 3 bosses where they would apologize when they used it.
I've had that happen
because they
recently, too.
they knew that I didn't, and they respected my feelings and respected that I didn't use that type of language, nor did I appreciate it. Even if I didn't say anything, my actions spoke volumes. So, but yeah, so these younger lieutenants would ask me about this, and I would share with them different stories. And the last kind of cap on my military career, I'm at the State Department. When I first got there, the Army wanted to send me to Command and General Staff College. That would have been at Fort Leavenworth. I would have been gone. So here I am into an interagency position where they don't have there's not a lot of rapport between DOD and State Department at times, because everybody has their own agendas. And a lot of times that's very true. And I saw that a lot in interagency meetings. And DOD has a lot of A-type personalities that like taking control of meetings, and they like being in charge. And that can really turn a lot of people off. I knew it was going to be a challenge coming in to build rapport and build trust. And the last thing I needed was to step out and go to a school and come back later. So I actually deferred that school. Some would have said that would have been a career killer. But I thought that was the right decision to make. And less than a year later, I was up for below the zone promotion, which was, you have below the zone, you have in the zone, and you have above the zone. In the zone is where you normally get promoted. Below the zone, you're ahead of track. There's only a small percentage. And so I came up for that, and I got my packet ready. I didn't even look at the results that morning because it just wasn't expected. I was in a very small selective branch, and it wasn't something I had anticipated. And I had a friend from a classmate from West Point, call and tell me congratulations. I'm like, for what? They're like, you came out on the lieutenant colonel list. And I was surprised. I didn't have most of the people at the time. I would have probably said I believed it too if I didn't have command general staff college, that I wasn't going to get promoted. Well, I come to learn that wasn't a prerequisite, but most of the Army thought it was. I actually had people, how in the world did you get promoted? You didn't have the schooling. So, well, it's not necessarily an end all. So I was blessed. I got promoted to lieutenant colonel, and last year and a half, I retired as a lieutenant colonel. I retired when I was a lieutenant colonel, but I'm officially a retired major because I didn't have enough time to retain the rank.
Oh, okay.
But the decision to retire was a family decision. It was the right decision. And people look at me, well, can you fight for it? You really can't. As a commissioned officer, as a warrant officer, different ranks you can. You can fight for your rank back. As commissioned, you cannot. I said, but the rank wasn't important. It was the time I got to spend. I said, I came in as an E1. I never imagined making captain or major, let alone lieutenant colonel. I got to experience some things that were well beyond any of my imaginations. And then to be able to go back to the unit that I had served in for so many years, deployed with, and to be able to teach soldiers for the next 11 years was a special blessing. And I look back over the years, I couldn't have anticipated, I couldn't have written the story. You know, God put Sergeant First Class Eugene Hickman in that room at that time and asked me if I ever thought about West Point. He was threatened with punishment because when he took me downtown to get my uniform pressed so I'd have a good picture for my packet, and there was an auto accident that day, and we stopped and rendered first aid, so he put me in for an award. And the battalion commander threatened him with punishment because fraternization was one of the biggest things. Well, he wasn't fraternized. He was trying to help a young soldier advance his career. But there was no, it was either white or black.
Yeah.
You know, there was no middle area. And they actually said, you can withdraw the award or face UCMJ. He said, I'll face UCMJ, keep the award. He actually stood that ground. I got that story later on. And we've since reconnected after 20 some years. And where we reconnected is he had served in Germany for so many years. He retired, worked at education centers. And when I finally found him, he was at West Point working at the education center. His son was a cadet. So he put him in that place at that time. He put Colonel Johnson and Cheryl in that place at the right time, where we started a singles group, and it gave me a different perspective on how you can be both an officer in the military and a Christian. And you can balance those, and you can balance those effectively. Giving and living your life to honor God in all aspects. He put the church, Barton Chapel United Methodist Church, in the right place at the right time, where my family had everything they needed while I went off where the Army sent me in different places at different times. The same with our church in Virginia, our friends in Virginia. But when it came down to it in 2019, God opened the door for a Masterpiece Retreat Center. In 2001, we had a vision to start a retreat center back here in Pennsylvania, where we could come back and give back to the community that had meant so much to me over the years, that had supported me while I'd been deployed, that helped shape me when I grew up. And in 2022, after 3 years of working with the retreat center and traveling back and forth from Virginia to Pennsylvania 2 to 3 times a month, we decided to go ahead and retire early from the civil service and come back here and work in the ministry full time. And it's been such a blessing. It was, we had a big plan laid out on paper, but God has continued to refine that, and sometimes not redefine it, but refine it and reshape it. And we would never have dreamed where we are today that we would be here doing some of the things we have the opportunity to do. We had always envisioned having a farm where we could have retreats and we could bring people in and do skill training for recently released inmates and veterans. And that may still be part of the plan down the road, but what God has us doing right now is creating events that bring people together of like interests in a Christ Center environment, together in a Christ Center environment where they can share and where they can build relationships, whether that's through crafting, whether it's hiking that we have this Saturday, whether it's getting together at the veterans home to sing or to share or to sit and talk, or to take a trip with veterans to DC or wherever we might go, or to have a dinner with them, bringing them together where they can meet people with like experiences and like interests in an environment that's centered on Christ. And that's the most important piece of it.
Which brought me to being able to go to Florida with you guys, which first time I've been to Florida since probably 2004, 2005. And the first time I actually ever got to go on a missions trip, at 28 years old, never had the opportunity. And when the opportunity arises where, it's like last minute take off work, I get the vacation days and it's covered that, because the biggest thing growing up was like, oh, here's a missions trip. Here's how much it costs. You got to put that money into it. And, for us, it wasn't possible. So for your ministry to be able to cover the cost that we needed, besides like just the snacks and stuff, which, is nothing, but it was a blessing to finally be able to go down and do something for especially people in need. And the two houses that we got to, especially the one Larry and I got to go to when we were painting ceilings, the little old lady there, she told us a story about how she lost her husband. The way she found out he died was his phone was in his pocket while he was on the way to the morgue. And that's not the way she called it. They answered and said, hey, we have your husband's phone. He's passed away. We take it to the morgue. And that is a horrible way to find out. But she was a spunky lady, just a joy to be around. She loved having us around, memorize our names just like that. Memorize my son's name when we were in conversation. So she's talking about him, showing pictures, and then the other family, she was very thankful, and her boyfriend was as well, to finally have a cool house, in the 100 and some degree weather for how many months living in one room because there's no insulation. So it was just a magnificent experience to finally get down and do something like that and help these people.
Yeah, and that wasn't part of the original plan of the retreat center either. God has opened some unexpected doors for us that you just have to have a sensitive heart, recognize when a door is open, and be able and be willing to step through it. And when the missions, we had one of Barbara's best friends, Nancy Joe, who we got to know pretty well down there. When the hurricane hit, she had been a great supporter of the retreat center, and we asked if there was any way we could help. She got us in contact with the church, and they got us in contact with IDES. And of course, the rest is history. We just finished our 4th trip with IDES. And, looking back to what I had said, the retreat center has really, how God has shaped it to where we sponsor events, bring people of like interest together. The mission trips is a unique group of people. Most of those people don't participate in our hikes normally. They're not our crafters. And some of them don't play instruments or sing on some of our concerts. They have a path, but they will set things down on a moment's notice to go out and serve in another state or to help people in it that have just experienced a disaster. And I tell you that some of the blessings, some of the stories that have come out of this, some of the way that some of our teams have been blessed and how they want to go back. I mean, the most common question right now is, when is our next mission trip? Well, I don't want to wish for the next one because it normally, comes after a disaster. But they're very eager to get back out there because of some of the things they have experienced, some of the connections that they made, even on this last one with the tornado cleanup. It was different. it gives you a different perspective on things. It gives you an appreciation for some of the things that you have. You also build relationship with other people on the team. On the lighter side, I don't know if you knew the story of the moose.
Mm-mm.
So the trip you were on, it started the trip before. Since we were in the nursery and there was all these stuffed animals around, some members of the team started stuffing people's pillows and beds with stuffed animals. Well, on the trip you were on, somebody stuffed a moose into somebody's pillow, which was discovered 2 weeks later when their wife decided to unpack everything and do the laundry.
So someone stole a moose from the
So
church.
the moose has been traveling.
Oh,
So the moose is now traveling with us. If we ever go back to Port Charlotte, the moose will make it home. Right now, he's become our mascot. He traveled to Tennessee with us. They did lose a little bit of control over him, and he's in protective custody right now until the next trip. I have him. He's in a safe house right now. He actually traveled on. We have pictures of him in the car traveling to Tennessee. We have pictures of him on the Bobcats. He was actively involved in our missions this last trip.
well, I thank you for coming out and talking to me. It's always good to get, conversation, especially with someone who has military experience, and like you said, you want to start up your own, whether it's a video series, YouTube series, whatever, to get some stories. And that's like I said before, I don't even know if there's any like Holocaust victims left to hear their story. And I mean, I'm sure there's archived videos of these people talking, but there's people that have had the most strange or exciting military stories that the only people that have heard it has been their family or close friends. So it'd be nice to hear other perspectives of besides what the media shows or what the history books say. So
Yeah, it's been such a blessing to look back over the last 38 years now, and how God has put so many things in place, put people in my life that I wouldn't have expected. The relationships, it has just been an incredible experience, and I'm so thankful that he gave me the opportunity to serve in the Army. That he gave me the opportunity to stay in the Army, to be able to work in youth ministry in Alaska at Anchor Park United Methodist Church, to help stand up Sunday schools in Georgia, and to work in the ministry down there as a lay pastor or as a lay leader, and then to work with Awana and the choir and some of our drama productions in Virginia. Just some unique. I would have never imagined doing some of the things that I got the opportunity to do, but again, God opens doors and gives us opportunities. We have to be willing to step through them. Mm-hmm. And you never know what's on the other side of that until you do it. Mm-hmm. So again, just thankful for the support my family has given me over the years. As you'll hear Amy and I talk about it, we've always been a team. It always seems odd if we're not together on something. Mm-hmm. And God has opened some doors back here separate from the retreat center, with Bible Adventure, with VBS, with Christians in Action, to do some of the ministries that our heart has just been yearning for since we left Virginia. So what the future holds, we'll see.
Well, thank you for coming on, and I really can't wait to see what your ministry has planned, or what God has planned for your ministry next. So
thanks for having me.
Thank you.